The frozen wilderness of Montana is no place for the weak, where winter's chill conceals as much danger as beauty. Life and death dance on the razor's edge. A lone bobcat cub, alone and starving, too young to fend for himself, steps into a world far crueler than he ever imagined. The shadows move, the snow whispers. He suddenly finds his world turned upside down when a pack of wolves closes in. A wolf pack, hardened by winter's grip, has marked him as their next meal. But fate is unpredictable. As the wolves close in and all hope seems lost, an unexpected force intervenes, setting off a chain of events that defy nature's most ruthless rules. The wild reveals a twist that defies everything we think we know. Prepare to witness a story where survival, instinct, and courage collide in the icy grip of winter, leaving you questioning whether nature's balance can ever truly be restored.
The bitter wind howled through the dense pine forest of northern Montana, carrying with it tiny crystals of ice that sparkled like diamond dust in the weak winter sunlight. It was early February, and the Flathead National Forest lay buried under 3 feet of snow, its usual verdant expanse transformed into a stark white wilderness. In this unforgiving landscape, life and death played out their eternal dance with unrelenting regularity. For Max, a 4-month-old bobcat cub, this dance had suddenly become terrifyingly real. His mother had disappeared 3 days ago while hunting, leaving him alone in their den beneath a fallen spruce. Hunger had finally driven him out into the open, his instincts warring with his fear as he attempted to find food in a world that seemed determined to eliminate him. The young cub's reddish-brown fur, spotted with black rosettes, stood out starkly against the pristine snow as he cautiously made his way through the forest. His normally proud ear tufts were flattened against his head, and his stub of a tail twitched nervously as he tested each step. At barely 12 pounds, Max was significantly smaller than an adult bobcat, his youth evident in his slightly gangly limbs and the remnants of kitten fluff still visible around his neck. 20 miles away, in the small town of Whitefish, Montana, Jim Harrison was preparing for what he thought would be a routine day of wildlife monitoring. At 58, Jim had spent the better part of 3 decades working as a wildlife biologist for the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department. His weathered face, creased by years of exposure to the elements, bore testament to countless hours spent in the wilderness. The silver threading through his dark hair and beard seemed to match the winter landscape he so often traversed. "You heading out today, Dad?" Sarah Harrison's voice carried from the kitchen of their modest ranch-style home. At 28, she had followed in her father's footsteps, working as a veterinarian at the local wildlife rehabilitation center. Jim pulled on his heavy winter boots, nodding as he checked his gear. "Got reports of increased wolf activity in the eastern sector. Need to check if they're getting too close to the ranches?" He patted the tranquilizer gun in its holster, a tool he hoped he wouldn't need to use. In all his years of service, Jim had always believed in minimal intervention, allowing nature to take its course whenever possible. Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding out a thermos of coffee. "Be careful out there. The weather report's calling for another storm system moving in by afternoon." "Always am, kiddo." Jim accepted the thermos with a smile, remembering how Sarah had earned her nickname Kiddo despite now being a grown woman with credentials that rivaled his own. "How's that young mountain lion doing at the center?" "Much better. Should be ready for release by next week." Sarah's eyes sparkled with pride. The rehabilitation center had become her life's work, a calling that seemed to run in the family. As Jim headed out to his truck, the weight of his equipment familiar and comforting, he couldn't have known that this day would test everything he believed about natural selection and human intervention. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as he drove his Ford F-150 along the Forest Service Road. its snow chains crunching rhythmically against the packed ice beneath. Meanwhile, Max had wandered farther from his den than ever before. The hunger gnawing at his belly had become impossible to ignore, driving him to take increasingly desperate risks. His mother had begun teaching him to hunt before her disappearance, but those lessons had barely scratched the surface of what he needed to know to survive on his own. The young bobcat's keen ears picked up the sound of small claws scratching against bark. A red squirrel, perhaps, or a pine marten. His instincts took over, and he dropped into a crouch, his spotted coat helping him blend with the shadows of the forest. But as he prepared to stalk his potential prey, a different sound froze him in place, the soft crunch of multiple paws on snow, approaching from several directions. The wolf pack had been tracking Max for the last hour, following his inexperienced trail through the snow with practiced ease. Led by a battle-scarred alpha female the locals had named Shadow for her dark gray coat, the pack had been pushed into new hunting territories by the harsh winter. Their usual prey of elk and deer had become scarce, forcing them to consider smaller quarry they might normally ignore. Max's fear scent filled the air as 5 wolves emerged from the trees, their movements coordinated with generations of hunting experience. Shadow took point, her amber eyes fixed on the young bobcat with predatory focus. To her right, her mate, a massive male with a distinctive white chest, moved to cut off any escape route toward the deeper forest. 3 younger wolves completed the circle, their tongues lolling as they anticipated an easy meal. The bobcat cub's heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes darted from one wolf to another. His mother had warned him about wolves, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing a pack alone. His small size, usually an advantage for moving through the forest's understory, now seemed like a cruel joke against these efficient killers. Jim Harrison had just finished checking his 3rd monitoring station when he heard it, a high-pitched cry of terror that cut through the winter air like a knife. 28 years in the field had taught him to recognize the vocalizations of every predator and prey species in the region, but this sound carried a note of desperate youth that made his chest tighten. Without conscious thought, he was moving through the forest, his snowshoes allowing him to traverse the deep drifts with practiced ease. The tranquilizer gun was in his hands, though he knew using it would be a last resort. Human intervention in predator-prey relationships was generally discouraged, but something about that cry had triggered a response deeper than professional protocol. The scene that greeted him as he crested a small rise made his breath catch in his throat. The wolf pack had a young bobcat cub cornered against a granite outcropping, the small feline's fur bristling as it tried to make itself appear larger. Jim recognized Shadow immediately. He had been tracking this pack for months, but it was the bobcat cub that captured his attention. The little fellow couldn't have been more than 4 months old, barely weaned, and showing signs of malnutrition that suggested it had been alone for several days. Even as Jim watched, the cub swiped at the nearest wolf with surprising courage, though its claws found nothing but air. Time seemed to slow as Jim assessed his options. The professional in him knew that predation was a natural part of the ecosystem. The wolves needed to eat, and nature could be cruel in its efficiency. But as he watched the young bobcat, fighting against impossible odds with such determination, he thought of all the animals Sarah had rehabilitated at the center, of all the times a small intervention had led to something magnificent. Making his decision, Jim reached into his pack and pulled out a canister of wolf deterrent, a combination of sound and scent that he had developed himself over years of field research. As Shadow tensed for the final lunge, Jim activated the device and threw it into the space between the wolves and their intended prey. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The canister released a high-pitched frequency that wolves found particularly distressing, combined with a scent that mimicked their most feared natural competitors. Shadow's ears flattened against her skull, and she took several steps backward, her pack following her lead. Jim didn't waste the opportunity. Moving with deliberate confidence, he positioned himself between the wolves and the Bobcat Cub, his body language projecting authority rather than aggression. He had learned long ago that wolves were intelligent enough to assess risk versus reward, and his presence, combined with the deterrent, was quickly shifting that equation. "Easy now, Shadow," he spoke in a firm, calm voice, one hand raised while the other kept the tranquilizer gun ready. "There's easier prey out there for you and yours." The alpha female held his gaze for a long moment, and in that look, Jim saw something that reminded him why he had fallen in love with wildlife work in the first place. There was calculation there, yes, but also intelligence and adaptation. After what seemed like an eternity, Shadow threw back her head and let out a short howl. As one, the pack melted back into the forest, leaving only their tracks in the snow as evidence they had ever been there. With the immediate threat neutralized, Jim turned his attention to the Bobcat Cub, which had pressed itself against the rock face, its small chest heaving with exertion and fear. Up close, the signs of the cub's desperate situation were even more apparent. Its ribs visible beneath its fur, its eyes showing the glassy look of dehydration. "Hey there, little fellow." Jim kept his voice soft and soothing as he slowly removed his outer jacket. "You've had quite a morning, haven't you?" The cub hissed weakly, more from fear than aggression, but didn't try to run as Jim carefully approached. Years of experience had taught him how to handle injured wildlife, and he could see that this cub was too exhausted and hungry to put up much of a fight. With practiced movements, Jim wrapped his jacket around the small feline, creating a secure bundle that would keep both the cub warm and prevent it from scratching him. As he lifted the package, he was struck by how light the animal was, far too light for a cub this age. "Sarah's going to love you," he murmured, already thinking of his daughter's reaction to this newest rescue. The storm clouds were gathering overhead as Jim made his way back to his truck, the precious bundle cradled against his chest. The drive to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was tense, with Jim constantly checking on his passenger. The cub had fallen into an exhausted sleep, its small body finally succumbing to the stress and fatigue of its ordeal. As he drove, Jim called ahead to the center, knowing Sarah would want to prepare for their arrival. "Dad, everything okay?" Sarah's voice crackled through the truck speakers. "Got a special delivery for you, kiddo." Young Bobcat Cub, probably 4 months old, severely malnourished and dehydrated. Just rescued it from a wolf pack. There was a pause on the line. "Dad, you know the protocol about predator-prey interactions." I know, but Sarah, this one's different. The mother's been gone for days, based on its condition. It wouldn't have survived another day out there, wolves or no wolves." He could almost hear his daughter's professional resolve weakening. "Bring it in through the back entrance. I'll have the examination room ready." The Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a state-of-the-art facility, though its exterior remained deliberately modest, a large, barn-like structure set back from the main road. As Jim pulled up to the back entrance, Sarah was already waiting. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the scrubs that had become her second skin. "Let me see our patient," she said as soon as Jim stepped out of the truck, her professional demeanor taking over. As he carefully unwrapped the jacket, Sarah's expression softened. "Oh, Dad, he's beautiful." The cub had awakened during the drive and now blinked at them with wary blue eyes. The color would change to yellow as it matured, they both knew. Despite its condition, there was still a fierce spark of life in those eyes that spoke to its will to survive. "Let's get him inside and checked out," Sarah said, leading the way to the examination room. The next hour was a flurry of activity as they assessed the cub's condition. Sarah's skilled hands moved with gentle efficiency as she checked vital signs, drew blood samples, and began the process of careful rehydration. "Well, it's definitely a male," she announced as she worked. About 4 months old, as you estimated. Severe dehydration and malnutrition, but no serious injuries. Actually, Dad, considering everything he's been through, he's in remarkably good shape. Jim watched from the corner of the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He's a fighter, that's for sure. You should have seen him facing down those wolves. Sarah looked up from her work, her eyes serious. He'll need at least 2 months of rehabilitation before we can consider release. And that's assuming everything goes well. Does he have a name yet? Jim asked, knowing his daughter's habit of naming special cases. Sarah studied the cub for a moment as she finished securing the foreline that would help rehydrate him. Max, she said finally. He looks like a Max to me. And so began Max's journey from desperate survivor to rehabilitation success story. The first week was critical, with Sarah and her team working around the clock to stabilize his condition. The cub proved to be an ideal patient, accepting treatment with a determination that seemed to mirror his will to survive in the wild. Jim visited every day, often bringing his field notes to update while sitting in Max's recovery room. The cub seemed to recognize him, those intelligent eyes following his movements with increasing interest rather than fear. By the end of the second week, Max had gained enough strength to begin exploring his enclosure, his natural curiosity starting to overcome his initial wariness. As weeks turned into months, Max's recovery became something of a local sensation. Sarah had always been careful about maintaining professional distance from the animals in her care, knowing they would eventually return to the wild. But there was something special about Max. Perhaps it was the circumstances of his rescue, or maybe it was the way he seemed to respond to human presence while maintaining his wild nature. The rehabilitation process was methodical and carefully planned. As Max regained his strength, Sarah and her team began introducing elements that would help prepare him for eventual release. Live prey was provided in ways that would encourage his hunting instincts, and human contact was gradually reduced to prevent imprinting. Jim continued his regular monitoring of the wolf pack that had nearly ended Max's life, noting with professional interest how they had adapted their hunting patterns in response to the changing winter conditions. Shadow and her pack had successfully brought down an elk the week after the encounter with Max, proving that their attempt on the Bobcat Cub had indeed been born of desperate circumstances rather than normal behavior. As spring began to soften the Montana landscape, Max's release date approached. The cub had grown into a healthy young bobcat, his coat glossy and his muscles strong from months of controlled exercise. Sarah had selected a release site well away from known wolf territories, but within suitable bobcat habitat. The day of release dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of spring visible in the tiny buds appearing on the trees. Jim and Sarah worked together to prepare Max for transport, both feeling the emotional weight of the moment despite their professional experience. You know, Sarah said as they drove to the release site, Max secure in a transport carrier in the back of the truck. When you first brought him in, I wasn't sure if we were doing the right thing. Natural selection and all that. Jim nodded, understanding completely. Nature can be cruel, but it can also be magnificent in its capacity for resilience. Sometimes, all it needs is a small chance. The release site was perfect, a rocky area with plenty of cover and known populations of rabbits and other prey species. As they set up the carrier, Sarah performed one final check of Max's condition, her movements efficient but gentle. "Ready to go home, buddy?" she whispered to the bobcat, who watched her with calm yellow eyes. They had indeed changed color as he matured. The carrier door was opened, and for a long moment, Max simply sat there, scanning his new surroundings. Then, with the same determination he had shown in facing down the wolf pack months ago, he emerged into the morning sunlight. He paused briefly, looking back at Jim and Sarah, and in that moment, both father and daughter felt the full impact of what they had accomplished. Then Max was gone, disappearing into the undergrowth with the silent grace that made bobcats such effective predators. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, not bothering to hide it from her father. "You did good, kiddo," Jim said softly, putting an arm around her shoulders. "You did real good." In the months that followed, their wildlife cameras occasionally caught glimpses of a healthy young bobcat in the release area, its spotted coat unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Max had not just survived. He was thriving, his presence helping to maintain the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Jim often thought about that winter morning when he had made the decision to intervene. In a career spanning decades, it stood out as a moment when the line between professional protocol and compassionate action had blurred, leading to something extraordinary. The story of Max became more than just a successful rehabilitation. It became a testament to the impact that human compassion could have when guided by knowledge and respect for the natural world. Sarah kept a single photo in her office at the rehabilitation center, a striking image of Max on the day of his release, his proud stance and alert expression capturing everything they had worked to preserve. That photo served as a daily reminder of why they did this work, often drawing the attention of visitors and new volunteers. 1 year after Max's release, Jim was conducting his regular wildlife surveys in the area when he came across something remarkable. In a protected hollow beneath a rocky overhang, he found evidence of a bobcat den. As he carefully approached, using all his years of experience to move silently, he caught sight of a familiar form. Max, now fully grown, watching over 2 small cubs of his own. The young bobcat had not only survived but had found a mate and was now contributing to the next generation. Jim's trained eye could see that Max still bore the distinctive spot pattern that had made him recognizable during his rehabilitation, but now he moved with the confident grace of a mature predator. The cubs, barely visible in the shadows of the den, were proof of nature's resilience and the far-reaching effects of that one crucial intervention. That evening, as Jim shared his discovery with Sarah over dinner, their conversation turned to the broader implications of their work. The rehabilitation center had grown over the years, taking in more animals and training new staff in the delicate balance between assistance and natural processes. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Sarah said, pushing her plate aside and leaning forward. "That morning with the wolves, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't made that split-second decision." Jim nodded, understanding the unfinished thought. One small action can ripple out in ways we never expect. Max isn't just one rescued bobcat anymore. He's become part of the ecosystem's recovery story. The success of Max's rehabilitation and release had far-reaching effects beyond just one bobcat's life. The documentation of his case, carefully maintained by Sarah, became a valuable resource for other wildlife rehabilitation centers dealing with orphan predator cubs. The protocols developed during his care were refined and shared, helping to improve survival rates for other young animals in similar situations. The story also helped bridge the gap between the local ranching community and wildlife conservationists. When Sarah presented Max's case at a community meeting, focusing on the careful balance between predator conservation and human intervention, she found an unexpectedly receptive audience. Even some of the ranchers who had traditionally viewed predators as threats began to see the value in maintaining healthy wildlife populations. 5 years after Max's rescue, the Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had become a model facility, known for its successful rehabilitation and release programs. Sarah had expanded her role, training new veterinarians in wildlife care while continuing to oversee critical cases. Jim, though officially retired, still conducted regular wildlife surveys, his expertise more valuable than ever in tracking the health of local predator populations. The wolf pack that had nearly ended Max's life remained in the area, though their numbers and territory had shifted over the years. Shadow, the alpha female, had produced several litters of pups, maintaining the pack's presence in the ecosystem. Jim's continued observations showed how the wolves had adapted to changing conditions. their hunting patterns evolving to focus more on traditional prey as deer and elk populations recovered. One crisp autumn morning, as Jim was checking his wildlife cameras, he came across tracks that told an extraordinary story. In the mud near a stream, he found the distinct prints of a wolf pack moving through the area, and nearby, the smaller but confident tracks of a bobcat, likely Max, having passed through the same space just hours apart. But unlike that desperate day years ago, these tracks showed no signs of pursuit or conflict. Instead, they were the normal movements of predators sharing the same territory, each filling their own niche in the complex web of forest life. This, Jim reflected, was perhaps the most powerful testament to their work. Not just the survival of one animal, but the restoration of natural balance. The forest could support both wolves and bobcats, each species playing its crucial role in maintaining the ecosystem's health. As he stood there, studying those tracks in the early morning light, Jim heard a familiar sound, the soft padding of paws on fallen leaves. Looking up carefully, he caught a glimpse of a mature bobcat moving through the underbrush. The cat paused briefly, its yellow eyes meeting Jim's in a moment of recognition that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries between wild animals and humans. Whether it was Max or one of his offspring, Jim couldn't be certain, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was that the bobcat moved with the confidence of an animal completely at home in its environment, neither fearful of humans nor dependent on them. This was the true measure of successful wildlife rehabilitation. Not just saving an animal's life, but preserving its essential wildness. The bobcat disappeared into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving Jim with a profound sense of satisfaction. In his decades of wildlife work, he had seen both successes and failures, had witnessed the sometimes harsh realities of natural selection and the occasional need for human intervention. Max's story represented the perfect balance between these forces, a moment when human compassion, guided by scientific knowledge and respect for natural processes, had helped maintain the delicate equilibrium of the wild. Back at the rehabilitation center, Sarah was preparing for a new generation of wildlife professionals, teaching them the lessons learned from countless cases like Max's. The center had grown to include educational programs for local schools, helping to foster understanding and appreciation for wildlife in the community's youngest members. The key, she would tell her students, is knowing when to act and when to step back. Nature has its own wisdom, its own ways of maintaining balance. Our role is not to interfere with that balance, but to help restore it when human activities or extraordinary circumstances have disrupted it. The story of Max, the bobcat cub who faced down a wolf pack, survived against impossible odds, and went on to contribute to the recovery of his species, became more than just a tale of successful wildlife rehabilitation. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of nature's harshest realities, there was room for compassion, for intervention guided by wisdom, and for the remarkable resilience of life itself. As the years passed, other animals would come through the center's doors, each with their own story of survival and recovery. But Max's story remained special, a testament to the difference that one moment of intervention, guided by knowledge and compassion, could make in the grand tapestry of wilderness preservation. The photo in Sarah's office continued to draw attention, sparking conversations about wildlife conservation and the role of humans in protecting and preserving the natural world. And somewhere in the forests of Montana, Max's legacy lived on through his offspring, their presence a vital part of the ecosystem's ongoing story of survival, adaptation, and renewal. Jim and Sarah's work had shown that while nature could indeed be cruel, it could also be guided back toward balance when human intervention was applied with wisdom and restraint. Their story, intertwined with Max's, became part of the larger narrative of wildlife conservation in America, a reminder that every life saved, every animal successfully returned to the wild, contributed to the preservation of the natural heritage they all worked so hard to protect.
In the harsh solitude of the Arizona borderlands, where the desert swallows secrets and silence reigns supreme, Sergeant James Hansen thought his isolation was complete. Stationed at a remote observation post 70 miles from civilization, his days blurred together in an endless vigil of watching and waiting. Day after day, beneath a relentless desert sun, his routine of vigilance and monotony stretched on, until one afternoon, a faint cry pierced the silence. Investigating cautiously, Hansen discovered a tiny bobcat kid abandoned against a rocky slope, weak and shivering. They say the desert shows you what you need most when you're at your lowest. For Hansen, that revelation came in the form of a tiny survivor, barely clinging to life among the sun-bleached rocks. Yet Hansen knew their companionship was fraught with peril. Rusty was wild and belonged to the desert, while Hansen's world was defined by duty and discipline. Could a soldier justify breaking the rules to save a tiny life, and at what cost to them both? What began as a moment of mercy would evolve into something extraordinary, a bond that defied military protocol, natural order, and the harsh reality of life in the borderlands. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky outcrop of Observation Post Epsilon, nestled high in the mountains of eastern Arizona. Technical Sergeant James Hansen wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and adjusted his binoculars. From this vantage point, he could monitor a vast stretch of remote borderland, an assignment that was as crucial as it was isolating. Hansen had been stationed at this remote border surveillance post for nearly 6 months now. The United States Border Patrol had established these minimally staffed outposts in coordination with military support to monitor trafficking routes. As an Air Force specialist with advanced surveillance training, Hansen had been assigned here after 2 tours overseas. His superiors had thought the assignment would be a welcome reprieve from combat zones. They hadn't accounted for the soul-crushing solitude. The observation post itself was a Spartan affair, a reinforced structure with living quarters, communications equipment, and an observation deck. The nearest town was 70 miles away. Supply runs came once every 2 weeks. His only company was the occasional Border Patrol officer who would stop by to collect reports and drop off essentials. Another thrilling day in paradise, Hansen muttered to himself as he scanned the horizon. The vast expanse of desert and mountains stretched before him, beautiful but unforgiving. He'd grown up in the lush forests of Minnesota, a world away from this stark landscape that seemed to swallow sound itself. It was late afternoon when he first heard it. A faint, distressed mewling coming from somewhere near the rocky slope below his post. Hansen froze, listening intently. The sound was so out of place in the silent landscape that at first he thought he might have imagined it. But there it was again, weak but unmistakable. Setting his binoculars down, Hansen grabbed his sidearm and cautiously made his way down the path that wound around the observation post. The mewling grew slightly louder as he approached a cluster of boulders. Peering carefully around the largest one, he stopped in his tracks. There, huddled against the rock, was a tiny bobcat kit. Its eyes, barely open, were clouded with weakness. Its small body trembled with each labored breath. Hansen scanned the area for any sign of the mother, but the stillness around him confirmed what he already suspected. The kit was alone. He knelt down to get a better look, keeping a respectful distance. The kit couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, far too young to survive on its own. Its tawny fur was matted, its small frame showing signs of dehydration. "Where's your mama, little one?" Hansen whispered. Later, he would reflect on that moment and the decision he made next. It wasn't just against regulations, it was against common sense. Wild animals, especially predatory cats, weren't meant to be handled by humans. But something in the kit's desperate situation struck a chord in Hansen. Perhaps it was the parallels to his own isolation, or perhaps it was simply the basic human instinct to protect something vulnerable. Removing his uniform shirt, Hansen carefully scooped up the tiny creature, which was too weak to put up much resistance. The kit felt feather-light in his hands, its heartbeat rapid against his fingers. "It's okay," he murmured, though he knew the words were more for himself than the animal. "I've got you." Back at the post, Hansen fashioned a small, protected space in a supply closet using an empty equipment crate lined with a spare blanket. He warmed some water and, using a clean eyedropper from his medical kit, carefully administered small drops to the dehydrated kit. Next came the challenge of food. He had no proper formula for a baby wildcat, but he mashed some of his canned tuna with water, creating a gruel that might be easier for the kit to digest. "This is temporary," he told himself firmly as he watched the kit lap weakly at the offering. "Just until you're strong enough, then you go back where you belong." But days turned into weeks, and the kit, which Hansen had started calling Rusty due to the reddish tinge in its fur, grew stronger under his care. Hansen knew he was walking a dangerous line. If his superiors discovered he was harboring wildlife, especially a predator species, there would be serious repercussions. Yet he couldn't bring himself to abandon the kit now that it depended on him. As Rusty grew, Hansen was careful to maintain boundaries. He never treated the bobcat as a pet, never attempted to cuddle it or train it. He understood that Rusty was and should remain wild. Instead, he created a routine that respected the natural instincts of the young bobcat. He provided food at consistent times, but didn't hand-feed once Rusty was capable of eating independently. He observed without interfering as Rusty began to explore the small territory Hansen had created for him behind the outpost, a sheltered area where the bobcat could remain hidden from any visiting officials. 3 months into their unusual arrangement, Hansen realized he had become deeply invested in Rusty's development. The bobcat was now the size of a large domestic cat, its distinctive bobbed tail and tufted ears fully formed. It moved with the natural grace of its species, practicing pounces and stalking techniques on desert lizards and insects. Rusty maintained a cautious distance from Hansen, which was exactly as it should be. But there was also a level of tolerance that suggested some form of recognition. The bobcat would appear at feeding times, watching Hansen from a safe distance. Sometimes, when Hansen sat outside during the cooler evenings, Rusty would emerge from the rocks and settle nearby, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same quiet moment. It was during one such evening that Rusty first made the sound, a soft chuffing noise that Hansen later learned was a non-threatening greeting among certain wild cats. The sound startled him at first, but when he saw Rusty calmly watching him, he understood it was some form of acknowledgement. Without thinking, Hansen mimicked the sound back. Rusty's ears twitched, and for a brief moment, their eyes met with a mutual awareness that transcended their different species. "We're both just trying to survive out here, aren't we?" Hansen said softly. The isolation of Observation Post Epsilon had been crushing before Rusty. The endless silent days had given Hansen too much time to replay memories of his overseas deployments. The friends lost, the violence witnessed. But now his days had a framework built around the care and observation of the young bobcat. The simple routines gave him purpose beyond the monotony of surveillance duties. Hansen began documenting Rusty's development in a personal journal, noting behaviors and growth milestones. He found himself researching bobcat development whenever he had internet access during supply runs. The more he learned, the more he understood that his current arrangement with Rusty couldn't last forever. Adult male bobcats required large territories, up to 40 square miles for hunting and roaming. Rusty was growing rapidly, and Hansen knew that eventually, the young cat would need more than what the area around the observation post could provide. More concerning was Rusty's continued association with humans. While the bobcat remained appropriately wary, the mere fact that it tolerated Hansen's presence could put it at risk if it encountered less well-intentioned humans later in life. The decision about Rusty's future was unexpectedly forced upon Hansen 8 months into their silent companionship. His satellite phone rang during a routine morning watch, his commander informing him that his assignment was being terminated. Border surveillance was being reorganized, and Observation Post Epsilon would be decommissioned within 2 weeks. Hansen was being reassigned to a training position at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. The news should have been welcome, an end to his isolation, a return to civilization and career advancement. Instead, Hansen felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What would happen to Rusty? Taking the bobcat with him was impossible. Not only was it illegal to possess a wild bobcat without proper permits, but it would be cruel to remove Rusty from the only environment it had known. Yet leaving Rusty behind with the post abandoned could be equally disastrous. The young bobcat had never learned to hunt properly from its mother and had become somewhat dependent on the food Hansen provided. That night, as Rusty watched from its usual distance, Hansen made a painful decision. He contacted the Arizona Wildlife Conservation Center, a sanctuary located about 100 miles from the observation post. The conversation was difficult. Hansen had to admit to having interfered with wildlife, something that could have professional consequences. But the staff member who took his call seemed more concerned with Rusty's welfare than with Hansen's transgression. "You did what many would have done in your situation," the wildlife specialist, a man named Rodriguez, told him. "The important thing now is to make sure this bobcat has the best chance at a good life." Rodriguez explained that they could send a team to safely trap Rusty and bring him to their facility. There, the bobcat would be evaluated and, if possible, prepared for eventual release back into the wild. If full release wasn't viable, Rusty would have a permanent home in a spacious, naturalistic enclosure at their sanctuary. The plan was set in motion. 3 days before Hansen's departure, a team from the Wildlife Center arrived. Using specialized equipment and techniques, they successfully trapped Rusty. Hansen watched from a distance as the bobcat, now nearly the size of a small adult, was carefully transferred to a transport carrier. Rusty's eyes, now a clear, sharp yellow, caught Hansen's gaze one last time before the carrier door closed. There was no way to explain to the wild creature what was happening or why. No way to say goodbye properly. Hansen could only hope that the sanctuary would give Rusty a better chance than he could. As the wildlife team drove away with Rusty, Hansen felt a hollowness open inside him. It was a familiar feeling, the same he'd experienced watching the medevac helicopter carry away wounded comrades during his overseas tours. That sense of being left behind while simultaneously being the one doing the leaving. The remaining days at the observation post passed in a blur of packing and final reports. Hansen found himself looking for Rusty at the usual times, only to be met with the empty stillness of the desert landscape. He left Rusty's journal behind when he departed, unable to bear the reminder of what he'd lost. Life at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base couldn't have been more different from the solitude of Observation Post Epsilon. Hansen was surrounded by people, noise, and activity. He taught surveillance techniques to new recruits, sharing his expertise from years in the field. His superiors commended his instructional skills, noting how his patient observation and attention to detail made him an excellent trainer. But Hansen struggled to readjust. The noise and constant social interaction overwhelmed him after so much isolation. At night, in his on-base housing, he found himself listening for the soft, chuffing sound he'd grown accustomed to hearing from Rusty. The absence of it made the nights seem emptier somehow. He tried reaching out to the Arizona Wildlife Conservation Center several times in the months that followed. Most of his calls and emails went unanswered or received only brief, generic responses. He understood. The center dealt with hundreds of animals and couldn't provide updates on everyone. Still, the not knowing gnawed at him. A year passed. Hansen continued his duties at the base, received a promotion, and even started dating a civilian contractor who worked in the administration office. On the surface, his life had moved forward. But thoughts of Rusty persisted, especially during quiet moments. Had the bobcat adjusted to life at the sanctuary? Had they been able to release it back into the wild? Or worse, had Rusty failed to thrive away from the only environment it had known as a kid? The uncertainty became a background hum in Hansen's life. Not crippling, but present. It was similar to how he felt about some of the missions he'd been part of overseas. There was never really closure, just a gradual accommodation to not knowing outcomes. 18 months after leaving Observation Post Epsilon, Hansen found himself scrolling through a veterans forum late one night. He rarely participated actively, preferring to read others' experiences and occasionally offer advice. But something prompted him to share that night. Perhaps the lateness of the hour, or perhaps the weight of carrying Rusty's memory alone for so long. He typed out his story, changing some details for privacy, but capturing the essence of his time with the orphaned bobcat. He described the isolation of the observation post, finding Rusty, their unusual companionship, and the painful separation. He ended with his ongoing uncertainty about Rusty's fate and his unsuccessful attempts to get information from the Wildlife Center. "I know it sounds ridiculous to be this concerned about a wild animal," he wrote. "But Rusty got me through some dark times out there. I just want to know he's okay." Hansen posted the message without expecting much response. Perhaps a few understanding comments from other veterans who'd formed unusual bonds during deployment. What he didn't expect was the private message that appeared in his inbox 3 days later. "My name is Dr. Elena Petrova. I'm a wildlife veterinarian who consults with several sanctuaries in the Southwest, including the Arizona Wildlife Conservation Center. A colleague shared your post with me. I believe I know the bobcat you call Rusty. If you're interested in discussing this further, please contact me." Hansen stared at the message for a full minute, his heart racing. He immediately replied, providing his phone number and asking Dr. Petrova to call at her convenience. The call came the following evening. Dr. Petrova's voice was warm but professional, her words measured. "First, I want you to know that the bobcat you call Rusty is alive and doing well at the center," she began, and Hansen felt a wave of relief wash over him. "He's approximately 2 years old now, which aligns with your timeline. He's identifiable by the distinctive pattern on his right ear, a small notch that was likely present when you found him." "That's him," Hansen confirmed, remembering the small imperfection in Rusty's ear. How is he doing?" Dr. Petrova explained that Rusty had been evaluated upon arrival and deemed unsuitable for full release back into the wild. His early human contact had left him not fearful enough of people, which could put him at risk. However, he wasn't tame either. He maintained a healthy wariness around humans and displayed strong natural instincts. He lives in one of our largest enclosures, nearly 2 acres of naturalistic habitat with rocky outcroppings similar to where he was found. He's healthy, hunts the small prey animals we release into his enclosure, and seems well adjusted to sanctuary life. Hansen absorbed this information silently, gratitude and a lingering sadness mingling inside him. I've worked with many rescued wildlife cases over the years, Dr. Petrova continued. The bond you described in your post, it's unusual but not unheard of. Animals can form significant associations, especially during vulnerable periods of their development. There was a pause before she added, I actually have a rather unorthodox proposal for you, Sergeant Hansen. I'm leading a small documentary project on rehabilitation success stories at several wildlife centers. We'll be filming at the Arizona Center next month. If you're interested, I could arrange for you to visit as part of our project. You would be able to see Rusty again. The offer caught Hansen completely off guard. Would that be good for him? I don't want to disrupt his life. We'd approach it carefully, Doctor, Petrova assured him. Many of our permanent residents have occasional controlled human interaction for health checks and enrichment. The documentary provides a legitimate context for your visit, and frankly, I'm scientifically curious about whether there would be any recognition after such a time apart. Hansen didn't need to consider his answer. Yes, I'd like that very much. The weeks leading up to the visit passed with agonizing slowness. Hansen requested leave from his commanding officer, explaining that he was participating in a wildlife documentary. He didn't elaborate on his personal connection to the subject. Some things were still too private to share. When the day finally arrived, Hansen found himself driving along a dusty road toward the Arizona Wildlife Conservation Center. The landscape was similar to that around Observation Post Epsilon. The same rugged beauty, the same unforgiving sun. But this time, he wasn't approaching isolation. He was driving toward a connection he had thought was lost forever. Dr. Petrova met him at the entrance. A tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her handshake was firm, her gaze assessing but kind. Thank you for coming, Sergeant Hansen, she said. Before we proceed, I want to manage your expectations. Wild animals, even those with past human connections, don't typically show dramatic recognition like domestic pets might. At most, we might observe subtle behavioral differences in Rusty's response to you versus other unfamiliar humans. Hansen nodded. I understand. Just seeing that he's okay, that's enough. Dr. Petrova led him through the sanctuary, past enclosures housing various rescued wildlife, hawks with injured wings, coyotes that had become too habituated to humans, a one-eyed mountain lion that watched them pass with regal indifference. They stopped at a large enclosure set against a natural rock formation. A small film crew was already set up nearby, their cameras pointed toward the habitat. Dr. Petrova introduced Hansen briefly, explaining that he had been involved in Rusty's initial rescue. Rusty usually becomes visible around this time of day, she explained, gesturing toward a rocky ledge within the enclosure. He has favorite spots for sunning himself in the afternoon. Hansen stood quietly by the viewing area, his eyes scanning the rocks and brush. Dr. Petrova stepped back, giving him space while the documentary crew filmed discreetly from a distance. Several minutes passed with no sign of the bobcat. Hansen began to wonder if Rusty somehow sensed the unusual activity and was choosing to remain hidden. Then, a movement caught his eye. A tawny form emerging from behind a large boulder. Rusty had grown considerably since Hansen had last seen him. He was now fully adult, his powerful shoulders and distinctive facial ruff making him unmistakably a mature male bobcat. He moved with purposeful grace, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the humans watching him. Hansen's throat tightened as he watched Rusty settle on a flat rock about 30 feet from the viewing area. The bobcat began to groom himself, his movements precise and deliberate. This was no longer the vulnerable kit Hansen had rescued. This was a magnificent wild predator, confident in its environment. Without thinking, Hansen made the soft, chuffing sound he had exchanged with Rusty during their evenings at the observation post. It was a sound he hadn't made in 2 years, but it came back to him naturally. Rusty's ears swiveled immediately. The bobcat stopped grooming and raised his head, eyes scanning the viewing area. "He heard you," Dr. Petrova whispered, her professional demeanor briefly giving way to excitement. Hansen made the sound again, keeping his body still and his movements minimal. Rusty's intense gaze swept across the humans present, then fixed directly on Hansen. For a breathless moment, neither moved. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Rusty stood and began to move toward the viewing area. Not with the rushing enthusiasm of a pet, but with the measured, deliberate pace of a wild predator. He stopped about 15 feet away, still at a safe distance, and sat down again, his yellow eyes locked on Hansen. "Extraordinary," Dr. Petrova murmured. "He never approaches the viewing area when strangers are present." Hansen remained still, hardly daring to breathe. He made the chuffing sound one more time, softer now. And then, a response. Rusty emitted the same soft chuff, his eyes never leaving Hansen's face. "He remembers," Hansen whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Dr. Petrova was careful not to overinterpret. "He's showing unusual interest and responsiveness, certainly. Whether it's true recognition or association with the sound is difficult to determine scientifically." But Hansen knew. The look in Rusty's eyes held the same quiet acknowledgement he'd seen during their silent companionship at Observation Post Epsilon. Not affection as humans understood it, not domestication, but a mutual recognition of the bond they had briefly shared. For nearly 20 minutes, Rusty remained in that spot, occasionally glancing at the other humans but always returning his gaze to Hansen. Eventually, as if satisfied with whatever assessment he'd been making, the bobcat stood, stretched, and calmly walked back to his sunning rock. "I've never seen anything quite like that," Dr. Petrova admitted as they walked away from the enclosure later. "We may have captured something scientifically significant for our understanding of wildlife-human interactions." But for Hansen, the significance was deeply personal. Seeing Rusty thriving in his new home, witnessing that flicker of recognition, it filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The nagging uncertainty that had followed him for 2 years finally dissipated. Before leaving the sanctuary, Hansen made a donation to support their work and arranged to receive updates about Rusty's welfare. Dr. Petrova promised to send photographs occasionally and to keep him informed of any significant developments in Rusty's life at the sanctuary. What you did, rescuing him, caring for him, and then making the difficult decision to let him go, that was the truest form of respect for wildlife, Dr. Petrova told him as they said goodbye. "You gave him a chance at life, and now he has a good one." Driving back to the base that evening, Hansen felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The Arizona desert spread out around him, the setting sun painting the landscape in golds and reds that reminded him of Rusty's coat. He thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together and then apart. And now, in some small way, together again. His time with Rusty had been brief in the grand scheme of things, a mere footnote in his military career. Yet it had left an indelible mark on his life, teaching him about connection, responsibility, and the difficult beauty of letting go. Some bonds, Hansen realized, didn't need constant reinforcement to remain meaningful. Some connections transcended ordinary understanding, crossing the boundaries between species and surviving against all odds. In a world where so much was temporary and uncertain, there was profound comfort in knowing that the silent companionship he'd shared with a wild bobcat named Rusty had been real, and, in its own quiet way, enduring. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hansen made the soft, chuffing sound one last time. The sound drifted away on the desert breeze, a farewell and a thank you to the wild friend who had helped him survive his own wilderness.